much better. You don't hear barking dogs.
And I
That's
understand
my
this is
wife's
being
ringtone.
televised too. All right, so, I'm Jeff Lingham. I'll, call this meeting to to order because we now have a quorum, and, we are being recorded. I guess we are live on the, Ashland Cable Access News, and, tonight we have the EPA here, Lisa Thuat and Kelsey Domville, from the EPA. I guess you'll be explaining what's in the works for the EPA here in Ashland. So, is the mic live over at the podium?
Yep.
Do you have an electronic show to put on to show?
Yeah, we have a slide.
Yep.
Oh, okay, so I have to turn around there.
Yeah.
Can it also?
It's
That,
actually
and you
everything
have
on
this
there
too.
Oh, so it's the same here?
Yep.
Okay.
That way you can.
Well, thank you for, I know we played around with a couple of dates trying to get everybody here, and glad we finally made it, and, you know, in spite of the booming crowd we've got here, we'll surge ahead anyway, because I'm very interested to hear
Sure.
what's
yeah,
up.
Absolutely. Okay. Yes, I feel like maybe it's just been a little while since we were here, so I thought and again, I sort of prepared this not knowing what the audience would be, if there were people that had never attended a meeting, or if there were some of it might be a little bit repetitive if you're kind of familiar with the site background, but I figured it couldn't hurt to include that. Okay. Yeah, so just basically objective, just to give you guys some information, to provide a little background for any people that are not familiar with the site, and just talk about just some recent activities we've done as far as just sampling and some indoor air studies, and answering any questions that the committee might have at this time. And additionally, piggybacking on that, we are in the midst of doing a 5-year review that's going to get published this month. So every Superfund site that has remedies in place that are not completed go through the 5-year review process. So this is actually would be the 6th 5-year review for Nyanza. So we've written that, and that's pretty comprehensive, and that will get published. And it's going to get published this month, but we do have time to include any like feedback that you guys might have. Kelsey can ask just some general questions about if you have any input that you want to share, about your feelings on the site, or how the community feels about the site, or progress on the site, whatever you wanted to contribute. So I can maybe do the presentation, and then at the end you guys can just ask any questions or look for any feedback.
Yeah, without going back over the, years and years of, data and history of the whole site.
Which will be in the 5-year review. Like we tend to,
Right.
well, actually I shouldn't say that. The 5-year review, they used to be extremely extensive, and now we've actually pared them down to really talk about the data that's been collected in the last 5 years.
So what's the difference between the 5-year review and the 5-year report? Wasn't there a 2016 report that came out?
Let's see, 2014.
With all the groundwater sampling and
Oh
stuff
yeah,
like that?
there was a report that came out in 2016 that was they were doing semi-annual groundwater sampling. So that was just a groundwater report. So that was part of Operable Unit 2. It was groundwater long-term monitoring, essentially. So that was just strictly groundwater data.
Right.
But every 5 years, so the last 5-year review for Nyanza was in 2014. But, the problem was it was probably like 100 pages, and it kind of
Right.
reiterated a lot of older information. But correct me if I'm wrong, the new intent of the new 5-year review format is to give people an update, really what new information or what new data has come to light in the last 5
In the
years,
last 5,
as
since-
opposed
so
to
from 2014 to
exactly
2019.
Yeah,
you'll
so we
wrap it up in
focused
this.
on operations and maintenance activities that the state does, new data that's collected, that's been finalized, any, you know, the data from that groundwater report, we've kind of summarized that. Some indoor air studies that have been conducted since 2014, that type of information. So we still have to include, you know, site history and background, just so if somebody picked it up and they had never been familiar with Nyanza, never knew anything about it, we still put enough background so people will know but we try to focus as far as like the data and the recommendations and the issues. We try to focus on things that have occurred within the last 5 years. So it's a much easier, more readable format than if you've ever read one in the past. Yeah. Yeah, so again, we don't really have too many new people here, but I don't know if anybody's watching it, you know, just the site history. Obviously, it was, you know, dye manufacturing companies that, where there was a lot of chemical waste disposal, lagoons, pits, vaults, discharges of the dye manufacturing process into, unfortunately, all of the surface, you know, the wetlands and Trolley Brook and Chemical Brook that surrounded the property. That's sort of the history of the contamination. This is kind of like a somewhat helpful, I don't know if you guys have seen this, it was in the NOBIS, like groundwater report. This is like an updated version. So you can see where the landfill is, and it just kind of shows you the general locations of the 2 extraction wells that are in place on the Worcester Air Conditioning property and the Nyakal property. So those are the 2 extraction systems that are pulling DNAPL out of the source area near the site of they call it the source area of the contamination. Then it kind of gives you an idea where Chemical Brook is, Trolley Brook, the eastern wetland, and that green area off to the left, that is a piece, that's a parcel that's called the potentially productive aquifer. So it's one piece that has been reduced in size. It previously extended almost all the way to the vapor mitigation area, but it's an area that Mass DEP has designated. They have a bunch of different factors, but Mass DEP designated that as for potentially future high quality drinking water use. I don't think it'll ever be part of drinking water, but
there used to be a town well right up by the DPW yard on the other side of the river. I think there's still an old structure there. I think the well casing has been, you know, grouted and sealed off, but it's up gradient and on the other side of the river.
Okay,
I think it's all in that gravel.
But this is this side of the river, though.
Right.
Yeah, on the north side of the river. So that area, it's just still designated as a potential future drinking water source based on the property size and the density. So they have a number of different factors they look at. So any contamination that extends into that area would be subject to the MCLs for drinking water for cleanup standards. But it's mostly in that area. It's primarily in the bedrock and not really at the surface there. Okay, and this is just kind of an overview of as the primary volatile organic compounds of concern that have been detected at the site and continue to be detected in the groundwater. And there's some semi-volatile compounds as well. Mercury was the biggest inorganic contaminant that was found in the soils and sediment, a lot of which was excavated and placed underneath the landfill, under the capped landfill. In Chemical Brook, too, there was, as they were excavating that, I found some additional history of Chemical Brook. They excavated because it's so close to the railroad tracks, there were concerns that too deep of excavation would undermine the railroad tracks. So that's why there's a geotextile liner over Chemical Brook. And as part of the state's maintenance activities, the state makes sure that that liner stays in place, and they work with Keolis and the MBTA because they'll plow along those tracks. So Mass DEP's been very good about making them tell us when they're going to do anything along those tracks. I know they were recently putting in poles. If you guys are familiar with those poles, they can like automatically slow down trains that are out of control. But, they were just gonna put these poles in and they didn't even, so Jennifer McQueenie from the state, is like, look, you guys, we don't care if you're working around the tracks, you need to let us know to make sure that anything you do is not going to interfere with like a remedy that we put in place at Chemical Brook. So thankfully, as it turns out, the poles were going to be on the north side of the tracks versus the south side near Chemical Brook. So they inspect Chemical Brook and pull any debris out of there, and they pull trees and such. Sometimes tree branches will go in, or debris from the properties on Magunko Road. And they'll make sure that liner that's over some of the sediments that still had some mercury contamination, they make sure that that's maintained. And that's just kind of like an overview of the 4 operable units.
Lisa, can I ask you a question just
Yeah.
to back up to that? So literally, is it a covering over that area? Like
Yeah, they put like a thick geotextile liner, and then they have like riprap, just crushed stone over the top of it.
So it's, there's no, obviously
Yeah.
there's no concern for exposure or anything, right?
No, there shouldn't be. That's why that we always have to be careful. Like we just keep track of keyless when they're, or some of the water that flows through Chemical Brook. If it's more of like a flooding rain, they'll inspect it to make sure that if there were heavy floods that were coming through Chemical Brook, to make sure if there's sometimes a little piece of the liner will be occasionally exposed, so they just will flag it, and then they will supplement it with crushed stone.
Okay.
So the state has a contractor that specifically, in this recently it's been Clean Harbors, and they'll do a full inspection of the length of Chemical Brook to make sure that the liner is covered and not exposed, and again, they'll make sure that there was no disruptive activities that Keolis may have been doing along the tracks, so.
Okay, thank you.
Could I add, just to piggyback that, another question with respect to someone, monitoring or going to site and observing and looking to see if there's been any damage. Several weeks ago, we had some severe rain, and we had a major flood in that area, and all the rain, all the ground, surface water
Yep.
had come down and actually flooded the Cherry Street railroad tracks and Tilton Ave area, and the water was coming from the tracks, flowing right down there. So I was just kind of curious whether or not anybody had recently gone down and take a look to see if there had been any issues with all that water, because it was quite deep.
I think the state might have been there a couple weeks ago. The issue is no one is allowed to walk along the tracks without contacting somebody. They have to have like an MBTA flagger, so they can't. So you can't even walk along the track to inspect it. Like you actually have to hire somebody. It just seems interesting. You have to hire somebody from Keolis to actually walk with the state contractors, like with the Mass DEP, with their contractors to walk the area. Because they theoretically have to flag the trains, because I think there's been so many incidents.
There's a liability. Actually, there's a no
Yeah.
trespass. There are no trespassing signs because it's considered private property.
Yeah, exactly. But they, I want to say, I have to ask Jennifer, but I'm pretty sure I can find out for you when they were last there. But I feel like they were just there like a couple weeks ago, because they usually
That's probably around the same time.
they usually do a
had that.
spring and a fall inspection,
Okay.
typically. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. So this is just a slide of the 4 operable units that we have, and as you know, the groundwater one was still the active one. The Sudbury River. They never did the sand capping because they determined it really wasn't necessary. And they basically, and it'll talk about it in the 5-year review, but the levels, they're going to be fish tissue monitoring for mercury that will continue as part of the state actually just hired somebody. They have a contractor, and they took a bunch of fish samples. I want to say in like October, November, but they don't have a final report yet. But from the previous data that we had, the levels of mercury in the fish tissue are actually on the decline. And they broke the river up into, several different pieces where they were collecting fish, and a couple of the reaches are below the cleanup level, which is good. So seems to be there's I think biological degradation of the mercury that's in the sediment. So the fish are, so the levels in the fish tissue are actually on the decrease. So they look at the data and they're doing like trend analysis. So we have it set up where every 5 years there will be some fish tissue data that's collected from the river. So we always have some data for the 5-year review. And then we have all the signs posted along the river too, with fish consumption advisories, so.
Must be need to be revised.
And this is just like a slide of,
A lot of them
kind of
are wrong.
depicts the GIS extent of the operable units.
Good.
Can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Excuse me, back there at the controls?
Miles.
Miles?
Yes.
Are the microphones picking up everybody's voices okay? Can you tell from where you sit?
Yes, I'm getting good levels.
Okay.
I just have it maybe down in the room just so it doesn't like feedback or anything.
Oh, okay, because I did hear complaints from people that are trying to watch this on TV and couldn't hear anything through the microphones a couple of meetings back, so I want to make sure.
Right.
Okay,
It's
that's
coming-
good.
It's coming clear back here. It's just quiet in the room just so that I can maximize it back here.
Okay, very good.
Thank
Thank you, I
you.
just checking, thank you.
And again, this is again for people that might not have the background, but this is just sort of a summary of what was done for this is the very first remediation effort that was done at the site back in the early 90s, where a lot of the contaminated sediments and the sludges were capped under McGunkle Hill, which is now the landfill. And the wetlands restoration that was associated with that, primarily I think the western wetlands, because the eastern wetlands that had a lot of mercury contamination, that was put into Operable Unit 3 for a separate remedial effort. And again, this is part of Mass DEP conducts the O&M, operations and maintenance, for the various components of number 1 and number 3 that we were discussing, like Chemical Brook, Trolley Brook. They check the diversion structures around the landfill, the perimeter fencing. They make sure there's been some issues with evidence of trespassing. There's no trespassing signs, but occasionally they'll find sections of fence that look like they may have been removed and then replaced. I don't know if it's hunters or just people going in with ATVs, but they walk the entire perimeter of the fence around the landfill and note any damage. This past fall, there was like a tree that was kind of precariously close to the fence that they were gonna cut the tree back. So they'll just make sure that the fencing is, it's not foolproof, you can't keep everybody out, but they'll keep the fence in as good a condition as possible. And then Operable Unit 3, that was the work with all the eastern wetlands and all the drainage ways that carried a lot of the contamination into the Sudbury River. That's basically the excavation of the mercury sediments that were also put under the landfill and had the wetlands restored. And Operable Unit 4, a little bit what I talked about, anything going on in the Sudbury River, the fish tissue monitoring and the signs in the five towns along the river. And again, that's now Mass DEP is doing the maintenance of those, so they're going to do annual inspections of the signage to make sure that those are not damaged or missing and properly posted, and as well as continue looking at the mercury trends in the fish tissue every 5 years. Okay. And this is the groundwater Operable Unit 2, which is still active. So there's been it's kind of just a summary, as you guys are probably aware of the issue with the groundwater. So it's flowing essentially from the source area of contamination just north of the landfill in sort of a north-northeast direction toward the Sudbury River. And there's what's the chlorinated ethynes and the chlorinated benzenes, which would be, your TCE, your cis 1,2-DCE, the dichlorobenzenes, that are part of the contamination. And obviously, there's a plume and a vapor mitigation area that's kind of been designated in the downtown area, just because the groundwater is coming closer to the surface as it's discharging into the Sudbury River. So because of the concerns with volatile organics being dissolved in the groundwater close to the surface, back in 2006 and 2007, they had identified the vapor mitigation area of where they felt that there could be concerns with vapor intrusion. And there were houses that had been tested that had detections in the indoor air, and actually here in the town hall too. So that's why this area still continues to have the vapor mitigation systems in place as a protection against vapor intrusion concerns. And the very first DNAPL product that the actual free phase product was discovered in the early 90s, because at one point they were going to put a pump and treatment system down by the former Nyanza facility, and they were designing it, and then they discovered actual product. So the treatment system wasn't designed to treat that. It was designed to treat dissolved groundwater. So what they did, they ended up putting in the 2 extraction wells, which are still operating on the Nyakal and the Worcester air conditioning property.
Could I ask a question with respect to that
Yep.
those 2 locations? And I know that this is probably this is some of the concerns that I've had with the DNAPL measurements. Has there been any increase in the amounts of product that has been coming out of that location? Because I know that the last time we were here, I was kind of surprised when they told us that there was still some major product coming out of there.
There still is, but actually they, and this is, we'll have this in the 5-year review too. The amount of DNAPL that they're recovering is actually on the decline. So it's either a factor, one of 2 things: either those extraction wells are in fractures where they've pulled all the product out already, or because the well screens might be clogged and need to be redeveloped. So Nobis Engineering, they have a remedial action contract with EPA, and they're maintaining those extraction systems. So we gave them the go-ahead to investigate those 2 DNAPL extraction wells to determine, have they reached the end of their useful life because they've pulled everything up that they tapped into, or do they need to be redeveloped and cleaned? So
Yeah, because
so that's
as I read back through the reports and the history of product collection, it's like every site visit, the wells were down for one reason or another. The backup power supply didn't come on, or the floats were hung up, so they weren't activating, and or they one reason or another, they just weren't. They were either seeing some product down there, but it wasn't being collected because of mechanical issues.
Yeah, lately the biggest thing they had there, like the heating system went down in the Worcester air conditioning well shed, so they had to put a new heating system in. That's actually been operating.
That's been chugging along.
Yeah,
reliably
exactly.
For,
Now, if the wells have served their lifespan, will they they'll just drill additional ones, or how would that?
Yeah, so that's kind of part of what, like our management and what we're evaluating as part of the feasibility study. Like, if these wells are still viable but just need to be redeveloped, do we continue these, or do we stop these and just put a bunch of new ones in? There's other potentially in situ treatments where you could potentially eject chemicals. If you can find more DNAPL in bedrock fractures, can we inject chemicals or some type of biological agents in there to treat, because that's really what's feeding sort of that, which is on this particular diagram. You've got contamination near the former manufacturing operations, which is sort of slowly dissolving and feeding the down gradient plume. So the more we could do in the source area to capture more of that free phase product that's slowly dissolving into the plume, the better. So I'm hoping the wells are still viable, but I guess if they're not, if they have pulled out everything they could, then that's probably a good sign that they were working. And they've pulled out, each one has pulled out like a few hundred gallons, so I know that they've been productive compared to other extraction systems. that
Yeah,
people have
certainly.
assumed- Yeah,
You know, you get more mileage out of, pulling free phase product
right,
than treating parts per billion.
right,
you-
exactly.
But, did you have was there gonna be a feasibility study too, as part of this? And
Yes, there's like a
would
draft.
that look at, either new recovery well locations or the feasibility of just replacing and renewing the existing well locations?
Yeah, I think we want to probably do a little bit more than just renewing the current ones. So that's what we're looking at, to potentially, if we can find additional DNAPL in that source area, can we put in additional extraction wells? Because when they put these in, the intent was to kind of have them be pilot wells to see, okay, will these actually work? And if they do work, can we put additional ones in if we can find more hot spots? So,
I mean, if they were put in the early 90s, they're, 25,
no, those were put in 2013.
2013?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, mid-2000s, they put in the vapor mitigation systems. Early 90s, that's when they were trying to put in I think a little timeline. Let me see here. Here we go. So 2007, they put in the vapor mitigation systems, and then 2013, they put in the 2 DNAPL extraction wells. But
Okay.
before they could do that, they had to do, they did a bunch of drilling operations, so they had to do subsurface investigations to try to find it. So they had to do, they did a few different drilling events to try to locate the DNAPL. Like, they did a whole DNAPL investigation. So before they could put in those, they had to actually target and find the right areas to install those. But yeah, so this overburdened TC plume is the one that, is of particular concern for vapor intrusion. It's one of and I talk about a little bit in the site challenges, but the railroad tracks kind of intersect this site. And unfortunately, if we don't have a lot of leeway with the drilling anywhere near the tracks, up to this point, we've pretty much been forbidden to be within, I forgot if it's like 50 feet of the tracks. Even I don't really think the MBTA or have really ever allowed any, like Dan Keefe, when he was RPM, to drill too close to those tracks, because they can't obviously undermine active railroad tracks. So there's somewhat of a concern, like, well, if we have, if there's some product that's sitting under the tracks, if there's a bedrock trough or something that's sitting under the tracks that's sort of like dividing the plume, how are we gonna get to that? Like, can we horizontal drill to it? Or would we be able to like do some horizontal drilling investigations? So these are all things that we're kind of trying to figure out.
And it's probably a simple question, but is it because of the integrity of the tracks?
The integrity of the tracks, yeah. Which is like also why they couldn't dig down and excavate as deep as they wanted to in Chemical Brook, because that's so close to the tracks too, so.
Well, I can see excavating, a trench next to the track, that
Yeah.
removes a fair volume of soil, but.
Right.
But drilling a well, you're, the drilling technique by itself leaves all the soil in place and
Yeah.
replaces it, holds it back with
I
the
mean, I understand
structure
we
of.
can't, you obviously can't put
type of
a,
the
a
pipe.
well probably a vertical well, but I'm still like thinking that maybe there could be some horizontal drilling that could be done near the track. So these are all sort of like things we're trying to figure.
An angle
Mhm.
well from
Yeah.
off-site to go underneath, but,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, one of my concerns is just, the residual contamination that's in the railroad ballast itself. I mean,
Mhm.
there's an awful lot of void space there, and, it makes it
Yeah.
highly permeable to groundwater moving in and through and along the tracks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as far as I know, I know there's some people on Pleasant Street that had some concerns about flooding in their backyards, but I think it was primarily stormwater related,
Yeah,
I think.
stormwater. Yeah, because
I guess they put some drainage, the MBTA put some drainage trenches on the north side of the tracks that it sounds like they were not very
Yeah,
effective,
and-
and I know they were causing some
and it's
community-
60 Pleasant Street,
Yeah.
or
Flooding
going
concerns.
down, I think it was Forest Ave.
Yeah.
The town cleaned out a number of the storm drains,
Mhm.
because they were just backing up and ponding water, so
Yeah.
a lot of that is draining better now, and it diverts, the stormwater now gets down to the culvert. It
Oh, it
stays
does,
on
okay.
one side of the river,
Mhm.
oh, excuse me, stays on the north side of the tracks, but heads it down towards Cherry Street.
Mhm.
And it's flowing better now. It was just
Yeah.
all silted up.
Okay, yeah, because I know some of the residents had complained about that they
Yeah.
felt that the MBTA had just put in this
And that was
not very
more than
effective drainage, these drainage trenches on the north side of the tracks, and it was causing people's backyards to flood like over.
Yeah, that was more
like
than a
by
year ago, but,
136, yeah.
I think it's on everybody's radar screen now to maintain those.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
they're old and they're imperfect.
Mm-hmm.
They may
Mm-hmm.
be sloping in the wrong direction, but at least it looks like the pipes are open now.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, it's good news, actually, yeah. Yeah, because it sounds like there is definitely a concern with backyard flooding there, for sure, on Pleasant Street. Okay, this slide, just kind of an overview, a little bit of the history of some of the work that's been done for the groundwater operable Unit 2. So back in 1998 was the first time that they started to look for vapor intrusion, so doing indoor air sampling and sub-slab sampling, again, in the areas closer to the river, in the downtown area where the groundwater is shallower. Bunch of ecological risk studies, which there really hasn't been, other than the mercury in the river, they really never identified ecological risk from the volatiles that are slowly diffusing into the river. I think they studied that pretty extensively, and there's some reports on that. And then 2004, they started to get a little bit more in depth with additional indoor air sampling, where they were starting to detect in not super high levels, but they were detecting site contaminants, in the indoor air. And that's kind of what drove the need for installing in 2006 and 7, doing the ESD to the original interim 1991 ROD, and they wanted to sort of like immediate, mitigate the human health risk from vapor intrusion from volatiles. Hence that in 2007 they put in those vapor mitigation systems to sort of control that risk of indoor air issues from anything that might be working its way through the foundation into people's homes, the first floor or basement of people's homes or businesses.
Now, are those units checked as well?
Yes, so that the state, that's also part of they have, every year they do an annual inspection. There were a couple cases where, they'd get one or two houses where they couldn't get access into people's homes, because they actually have to physically go into the home. And they will go in the basement and they look at the manometer, and they basically will look at the system, they check the fan operation, and they've put little sampling ports in the floor just to make sure they're getting the vacuum pressure so that the sub-slab, this is basically a sub-slab depressurization system. They want to just make sure that there's still vacuum to feel confident that, you know, vapors are getting pulled away from the slab and being vented. Yeah, I think they might occasionally have one or two properties where people just won't give them access. I know there was a house that was over here near the town hall that I think they weren't able to get into for a few years, and then they have a new owner who's now let them in, and thankfully no one turned off the fan, and because that's always the risk
No,
too.
that's
It's
good.
like we don't want people to turn off the fan, but yeah. So the only ones that there was just one property on Main Street that got redeveloped into like a mixed commercial residential building, and we talked to him about that particular developer. About he was just going to put in like a vapor barrier, but we actually ended up convincing him to put in a more active system for. So that was good that he wasn't required to do that, but
Was that 21 Main Street?
yeah, that was 20 Main Street.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
okay, so
Mhm.
we've never quite been sure whether anything was installed there, and
Yeah,
if
he-
it was, or whether he slid by and got it built without
yeah,
doing anything,
it
because.
wasn't on any plans, so we kind of pushed back, and yeah, he did demonstrate
Okay.
to us that he had it was putting in a passive system, so he had passive venting and he had the piping going through the roof, but the last I was told that he was going to put a fan attached to it too, because he was going to
So
do that.
there's
He does have
there's a vapor barrier
yes.
plus piping for
Yeah.
a depressurization system. You just don't know whether
Yeah,
actually
he said
has
he
the
was gonna
pump
put
on
the
it yet.
fan on it, but we were, I mean, we were okay as long as it was at least a passive system that was
Yeah.
gonna vent, so that was good, yeah. Cause there was
Okay.
actually no legal requirement for him to,
Right, and
to do that, yeah.
it was sort of before discussions about, a vapor bylaw,
Right,
was fomenting in town here, so,
yeah.
okay,
Yeah, I would say, cause Jennifer McQueenie from the state, she was pretty proactive about,
okay.
let's just keep, talking to this developer and make sure that they do the right thing, and, cause otherwise we didn't wanna have to, do any, I don't know if we could have done anything legally, but we didn't wanna have to inform people in the building that they might be, in a building that's
Right.
subject to vapor intrusion, so, that was good. Okay, yep, and this is just some additional in the last few years, again, the Indianapolis extraction systems that were installed in 2013. And then there's been actually like 3 indoor air sampling and sub-slab sampling events. So one of the objectives of the 2006 decision document was to sample the indoor air at homes that are outside of what's mapped now, where people have systems, to see, do we need to expand it? Are there any vapor intrusion concerns outside of where we currently have systems? And yeah, Dan Keefe looked at a couple of industrial buildings in 2014. What's now, I think, a United Home Expert. It was called something different back then. And that was a commercial building, and they did not find, there was no issues with indoor air in that building. In 2016, they looked at the police and the fire station, and there was no VI concerns there. And 2018, just looked at some homes along Pleasant Street and the church across the street as well on Main Street. And, there were some homes where there was some contamination that was like present in the sub-slab, but fairly low levels, but nothing was migrating into the indoor air. So, yeah, so thankfully we did not find any cases of needing to expand the vapor mitigation systems. So that was kind of positive.
So can I ask a question, a hypothetical question, that if a developer comes into town and wants, or is planning on building something right downtown here, would they have to get, or would the EPA get involved with them to make sure that there isn't any vapor issues in that site where it is downtown?
Well, so we've had, In the locations where we currently have the vapor mitigation systems installed, if somebody's going to redevelop and tear one out that we installed, we push back on them to install a new one, which is kind of similar to what we did, 21 Main Street. Like, okay, we put something in there that we were trying to, mitigate the risk of vapor intrusion, so we really need you to install a replacement. Or similarly, if a building is expanded, so if an addition is put on a building, we would like to, see the developer make an amendment to that building. And we're happy, if somebody is redeveloping, we're happy to come in and do indoor air sampling as well.
Okay.
But if it's outside of that zone, because we haven't found any issues in the indoor air, we don't require it, but it is a recommendation. It's a good idea, I think, even if you're sort of like on the fringe of the area where the
Yeah,
systems are
that's-
installed. We kind of have just like a set of guidelines. Also too, if we've had cases where excavation, where they might be coming into contact with groundwater for utility work or anything like that, just so people don't come into contact with the groundwater, we usually recommend health and safety plan and having environmental monitoring on site with a PID, just to make sure that there isn't anything off-gassing from the shallow groundwater that people might be encountering.
You can just add too, if there's, on some sites we have institutional controls that prohibit that kind of development without our knowledge, but if you know through the town of places that are being developed in this area and wanna, advise us or elevate to the building, I assume to get pull permits and everything through the town, we're happy to work with building departments and that sort of thing to
Okay.
just kind of keep an eye on what's happening.
Yeah, we've had a few referrals actually for different projects through I don't know if she's still here, Sheila Page. I'm not sure with the planning department and the Conservation Commission. When they're reviewing their permits, they've come and asked us for can we review?
Yeah, as these
especially when
permits-
they're putting in
yeah.
subsurface stormwater systems. We just we don't want too much going into the groundwater because I can understand people are trying to now channel the surface stormwater into the groundwater or slowly diffuse. So as long as you can show me that what you're designing is not going to alter the groundwater around there and push contamination into areas where it isn't already there. So so far that seems to be where the handful of projects that they've had us look at plans for, they've either come from the planning department or the conservation department. So I feel like they have been pretty proactive in letting us know. So we can't force anyone to do that, but we can sort of say, well, we want to protect the remedy. We don't want the groundwater plume altered by you guys making some sort of a change in the subsurface that's going to impact the regional groundwater flow. So, but yes, we certainly don't mind getting those requests and reviewing those. Yep. So this is somewhat of this is sort of the status of this particular of Operable Unit 2 with the groundwater. We do want to kind of come to some final remedy for the groundwater, and again, it's like we were mentioning, the potential expansion of either the extraction systems or newer additional alternatives. As I had mentioned, potentially in situ, chemical injections, if we can locate areas of contamination where maybe we could accelerate the degradation of some of the contaminants, if we can locate more pools of DNAPL. So these are the things we're still evaluating. Yeah, it's been a little bit slower process than we had anticipated because, between the shutdown and then just government process is just a lot slower than, so we just want to make sure we're looking at everything really closely and coming up with what would be, reasonable cleanup levels for the groundwater. Essentially, the goal is to, if we can, we'd love to just reduce the concentrations in the groundwater, not so that it's drinkable necessarily, but just so we don't have vapor intrusion concerns. So that's the biggest risk that would be driving any remedy that we would be looking at for Nyanza, is can we lower the concentrations so that we don't have, so people don't need to have sub-slab systems or vapor mitigation systems. Yeah, and the way they're kind of looking at it is, you know, they've kind of divided the site into sort of two separate areas. So you've got the source area where you had a lot of the historical releases, and where most of the manufacturing and the industrial activities occurred. And then that is sort of driving that down gradient groundwater plume. So how can, you know, how they interrelate, and what can they do in the source area that would improve the concentrations in the plume that's flowing under the downtown area. So in general, you know, the plume has been stable. There are some like localized decreases, but there's no really huge trends. So it's generally pretty stable at this point. So it doesn't seem to be a ton of degradation or sort of natural attenuation of the contaminants. I don't think the geochemistry is really favorable for these contaminants to be, you know, getting reduced on their own. So and I think there's still, unfortunately, a little bit too much DNAPL that's sort of feeding the plume. So that's why we're kind of looking at, they're analyzing it from like two different phases.
So if I can, just in English, so you're saying that the levels in the plume have not reduced over time?
Yeah, there aren't too many, like, thankfully not increasing. And there's some localized decreases in certain contaminants. But in general, there's no like
They're
really
just stable.
increasing or decreasing trend. They tend to be pretty stable. Yeah, so the plume is generally stable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is stable as far as where the high concentrations are
Yeah.
and low concentrations,
Mm-hmm.
but the groundwater is still, in
Moving.
itself, is moving.
Yes,
So it-
exactly.
So it picks up contaminants from the
Mhm.
higher area,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a little bit of it dissolving. It's not degrading, but it's
Yeah.
being diluted as it moves downstream.
Yeah, there's some areas where like the TCE has degraded to some of the daughter products, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of degradation, so it obviously is going to need some help, I think. So it's not naturally attenuating, and that's part of the 2015 groundwater report. They looked at sort of the geochemical indicators as where you could get like biological degradation. The ones that are particularly, it's like the chlorinated benzenes, unfortunately, like the 1,4-dichlorobenzene, the 1,2-dichlorobenzene, those seem to be pretty persistent, and they don't seem to want to naturally degrade. And those are big components of the DNAPL. When they sample the DNAPL, there's actually more of the chlorobenzene compounds in the DNAPL than even the TCE, so.
But a treatment
interesting.
for the chlorinated solvents is distinctly different than treatment for any of the metals.
For metals, yes, correct, yes.
So was it the anticipation, well, from the beginning, was it anticipated that the levels would and it's not, so then therefore they would look at doing something alternatively to help it along the process?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think they thought at one time maybe some of it would sort of a little bit
Right.
degrade on its own,
Naturally.
which is why they did the groundwater monitoring from like 2012 to 2015 to look at it over time. You know, what are the trends, like what are the data trends, and you know, would any of it degrade, and was the geochemistry in the subsurface favorable to biodegradation and just natural degradation, but doesn't seem to be, the conditions aren't all that favorable for that.
So then, if it's still there and the groundwater picks it up, where would it show in the groundwater? Somewhere where we're not testing, right? Because we're testing
Yeah, well, if that on the plume maps, there's different, like if you, in the groundwater report, there's different maps for the different contaminants, but, it is surfacing. Like I said, for some reason, I think between the railroad tracks, I think there may be like a bedrock trough, where if you looked at the plume of the bedrock versus the overburden, it's almost as if there may be some contamination that's sinking into the bedrock and then resurfacing back up into the overburden, because there's this interesting gap in the plume at the surface area. If you look at the TCE map I put in there, it's, but the bedrock is like more of a consistent plume.
No.
I just wish I could take a camera just
I know.
underground to see what's under there, because it's like, what is going on in the
But,
subsurface? Yeah.
and again, I apologize, kind of layman's terms, so thinking that's where the track area is?
Yes, yeah, I know,
I
Dave
mean-
Buckley with Mass DEP, he's mentioned at times, I think he thinks that there could be some that's sitting under the tracks, some of the contaminants, could they be sitting under the tracks, and like an old channel, I think they mapped out, there's a trough that maybe at one time was like a part of the Sudbury River, an old, underground trough.
Yeah,
like a
because there
bedrock
is,
trough.
in one of the old reports, there is a bedrock contour map.
Yeah, yep.
And I know,
I forget whether,
being new to the board, I mean, I'm not gonna solve all the problems, but
No.
you would think that would be enough to get access to the property to do what needs to happen, to at least find out what's there.
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe I'm simple-minded.
Yeah,
think that
you
that's
know,
enough
kind of depends,
evidence
like,
to-
because if there is still a lot of the deemed apple, though, in the main area of the manufacturing, I think there's still a lot that can be pulled up there. But we just don't know. They've gotten as close to the railroad tracks as they can, basically.
So that
And they
probably is the
haven't really
secondary
found
concern.
a lot in that area. Everything that they've really hit has been either on like the Worcester air conditioning property or like the Nyakal property, so
Okay.
still pretty much
Okay.
along McGunko Road and
So even though it might be
Worcester air
concern, it might be
conditioning, yeah.
secondary, I mean, it's a secondary concern, it's not a,
Yeah,
okay. That
I-
explains.
yeah, it seems like the bulk is still in, because that's really where the highest levels still are,
Okay.
like, just north and south of the tracks in the area of the former facility, yep. Yeah, and then this is just some of the site challenges that we're finding as we evaluate what further to do with the groundwater, because you've got a highly fractured bedrock, below the site, and you've got two different types of, contaminants. So the chlorinated benzenes have to be treated with, different chemicals potentially than the chlorinated ethings. You have two different types of volatile compounds. And in the past, they have had trouble, like, I think they would have put in more extraction wells, but they had some trouble locating, I think, the Dean apple, at more locations. So I think they just need to do, a little bit more, aggressive investigation to find Dean apple.
Do they intend to do that at some point?
Well, that's part of what we're hoping with this feasibility study, that we will, because it's a fund lead site too, so of course we have to get money from, headquarters. So the fund lead sites, I know, they get prioritized.
Yeah, and it really does kind of depend on the year and the funding, and this site is one where we don't have a responsible party paying for it, so it's.
Well, you figure this is an election year, you would think that they would give you the money.
I know, right?
It's also a fund, so it's not necessarily, it's a fund that comes to the region, so we get a bulk of money. So it's not as if, folks in the state necessarily go to headquarters and say, we need money for this
Mm-hmm.
particular state. That does happen sometimes, but it is a complicated process. There's no longer a superfund tax.
Mhm. And then I think, they prioritize is if it's groundwater that's, impacting drinking water supplies, I think that, or threatened drinking water areas, I think that those get like ranked higher than,
But there
Think
is,
ground.
I would say in this administration, a strong emphasis on completing work at sites. So the sites like this that have been active and had work ongoing tend to continue to be funded. There are some newer sites that are just getting listed that, we don't expect to get money for some time because there's an effort to try and finish the work, so to speak.
How far, how far away from the tracks are you allowed to dig or drop a well to do any type of boring tests?
I feel like I'd have to look back. I feel like Dan Keefe mentioned it was, they couldn't go within maybe 50 feet of the tracks. I'll have to double check. I'll have to find out the exact
Well, that's kind of interesting
distance.
because the town owns a piece of property at the corner of Tilton
Yeah.
and Cherry Street.
Yeah, it could be less than that. I just remember it was,
Which-
they were restricted with the drilling. I'd have to
All
look
the
back at
open
the
wells
exact
and all the
setback.
open troughs that, over the years, was right in that particular area.
Oh, off of
I
Cherry
would
Street.
think that would be a point of interest to drop a well, or do some type of drilling to see if there's any DNAPL in that specific area.
Oh, the north side of the tracks near
On the north
Cherry
side of the
Street.
tracks.
Near Cherry Street.
Yep. Matter of fact, if you drive by it now, you see large mounds
I
of
was gonna say, do we know that it
stone.
hasn't been done?
I don't
I think
I
there
don't see
could be a well in that area, but I'm not sure. I'd
I
have to
believe
look
there
at
may
the
be
well
one on the
map.
private
yeah.
property, to the folks that live in that corner. But that was for mitigation purposes for vapors, I
Yeah.
believe. I'm not sure if it was for,
Yeah, there
any-
were, we actually, so one of the things that, because there is so much private property, in the downtown area, that was one of the issues, was we tried to install, we wanted to put some wells on a few private properties, and people just didn't consent to it.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the challenge, but thankfully, we were able to put them, on, in the street
Yeah.
and, on town property. We put one near the Ashland Historical Society there, and then we put one at, the corner of Water and Pleasant Street. But that's one of the challenges, like, I don't think we would have probably a difficult time, doing any type of, like, active treatment, because people didn't even want a well. I just think people just don't want, oh, is that some sort of a stain on my property? Oh, I don't, it's a data point in my property,
Right.
people just aren't comfortable
Well,
with it.
that's it exactly.
Yeah.
They fear that
And unless, it would be
devaluation.
tough for us to prove that we would have to put one there. It's, so we try to go through the access route, so, where we had a couple data gaps, we were able to put them on the town property. But again, some of the private property, we haven't had success with getting, a permission for well installations. And this is just, so like I said, I'm mentioning the 5-year review, that we currently are pretty close to finalizing. And then, as you guys are familiar with the solar project in town, the Ashland Solar Project. So I've been working with Dave Buckley on that. Since the landfill is technically under the jurisdiction right now of Mass DEP, they're sort of the lead on it, so their legal team is the lead, but we participate sort of jointly.
So you're working with Citizens Energy Group right now?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. So they had to show that, that financially, that they have, sort of it's almost like an escrow fund, that they can't just abandon the solar array, so they can't just walk away. They would have to have enough money in an account so that it could ever, someday be properly decommissioned, and,
Bond.
just the fact that how they constructed, that it had to sit, on the landfill, that they couldn't, be intruding into the cap. They have to run a couple, like, I think, grounding, but they did that at the Charles George landfill up in, Tingsboro, and it was fine. So we just didn't want anything really super intrusive on the cap layer, but both Mass DEP and EPA, we both had like independent structural engineering reviews of the solar proposal, to make sure that the cap could withstand the weight of solar panels. And so we had two I think very good structural engineers like confirm that. So we just wanted to be like overly cautious before we approved it, to make sure that the cap is pretty solidly built, and we just wanted to make sure it could handle the load of a solar array. So
Of that size?
yeah. But the way they're placing the ballast blocks, and the fact that they're, sort of like the weight is spread out on the surface, that it's, so as long as the cap is maintained. So that, and the landfill gets inspected as part of Mass DEP's, annual inspection semi-annual inspection program. The owner of the landfill land, he's responsible for getting the mowing, for mowing the cap and maintaining it. And I think the solar company is gonna take over that. So they'll be doing, which is pretty typical with other projects I've seen, they'll take over like the maintenance. So they'll be mowing around the solar array, they'll be mowing and they'll maintain, and
Now, is that part
entry
of the
points.
contract that they both sign, that Energy, Citizens Energy Group signs with Mr. Gaynor? Who is the
Yes,
property
yeah,
owner?
it's usually,
So
yes,
that's
it's like
part
a
of that
maintenance
terms and
agreement,
conditions?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah. So, yeah, we just want to make sure that
Yep.
once the array is in, that they still maintain the mowing of the cap, because ultimately it still has to be inspected for,
Right.
subsidence, we're gonna make sure there's no sinking or any areas, that need to be repaired on the cap, so.
okay, good.
Yeah, occasionally they'll just come across maybe where the mowers, maybe they're just a little sloppy, they just might put some tread marks or something on the surface of the landfill cap, but it's just pretty much on the vegetation, it doesn't sink really deeply in there, so. But we just pretty particular about how they are careful around the caps and around the vents too, just making sure they take care around the vents. And like the side slopes too, keeping the side slopes in good condition, yep, so.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and as far as I know, they were still trying to figure out the financials, but I was told some point, either this month or next month, they're gonna start doing the construction, and, I know at least myself and or Dave Buckley, we're gonna try to get out there to watch them do it to make sure that they're following the conditions, and, so that may occur in the next couple of months, once they figure out the paperwork. I think there was a little bit of a delay because they had an interconnection agreement with utility, I don't know if it's Eversource here, but for some reason they had to redo that or revise their connection agreement with the power company before they could get started. That's
They
pretty
didn't give you a
much what we have.
specific date as to when they were gonna start, they just said next month?
Yeah, I know that they've sent us a couple just financial documents
Mhm.
to review, just to make sure that we're okay with the, legally with the
Yep.
language. So I feel like they're probably pretty close, cause once
Okay.
they get those settled and once they're, in a position where they've got the go-ahead with their electrical interconnectivity agreement, then
Yeah.
I think they can start construction, yeah.
I do have one question with that, and I know this is off the beaten track with respect to why we're here. But when you mentioned the solar array, I know that we
Mhm.
have a small one up off of our landfill on House Street.
Mm-hmm.
I know they had to install a couple of telephone poles because of the service wire that needed to
Yeah,
make the
yep.
connection. Is that gonna have to happen on top of the cap? And if so, isn't that gonna cause a problem with them going into the ground?
No, so the poles are not gonna be on the cap.
Okay.
The way it's being designed, the poles are gonna be, there's almost like a little bit of like an access road. What's up? Yeah, the poles are in an area that is off cap.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's really nothing they're putting like a pad, I think like a transformer pad, at one's, but they're all that stuff is off cap, yeah, we didn't approve of, poles or,
Okay. Because I know we had to do it
pads or anything
up on
like
House
that.
Street, that's why I was
Yeah.
a little concerned about,
mhm,
especially that cap.
mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, so they are gonna put poles, but they're, I don't even think they're gonna be inside the fence, I believe they're actually just gonna be outside the fence, there's like a dirt access road,
Mhm.
that kind of almost hugs the MBTA access road. The last I saw, that's where the poles are gonna be, because there's definitely nothing on the cap.
Okay.
Like, so the only thing that I think they might have to bury, like, interest, like, some of the arrays just need grounding plates, but you're talking a very small surface area in just like the top couple inches of soil, so, and we actually asked before they even start that, like, we wanna observe how they're doing it to make sure that it's minimal disruption, but like I said, they put these grounding plates, on the Charles George landfill, for their solar array, and yeah, there was no issues with just intruding just a very little bit to ground the
Thank you.
panels,
I
yep.
didn't mean to digress into another topic, but
That's good.
No, but that's a good question. No, and those are all the things we actually looked at, like where are you installing the various components of the solar array, because they can't be on the cap
Mhm.
other than the flat ballast blocks, yeah.
thank you.
Yep.
I'm good.
Thank you for the update.
Sure, I know, I feel like there's probably more than I thought maybe.
I just wanna talk a little bit about the feasibility study, cause
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
very confused with where that's at. Just the status and the next steps, I guess.
Yeah, so right now, I mean, it's technically, I guess, in like the management review process, as they
Okay.
call it. So, all of EPA management and Mass DEP has to be, there's be like, a number of different alternatives, which like mentioned might be, putting in more extraction wells, or maintaining what we have, or doing in situ treatment, or, so there's different options that all have like different costs. So essentially, like, EPA management has to, review all of the alternatives and the costs. And then, each remedies have operations and maintenance costs, so the state weighs in on how much they would have to maintain any additional remedial work at Operable Unit 2. So then also you have to come up with cleanup levels. Usually, in this case, I think we might be looking at like some site-specific cleanup levels, like I mentioned, to mitigate the vapor intrusion risk. I think that's the biggest thing, because we're not cleaning it up to drinking water standards, except, as I mentioned, there's just that one little gap. There's that one little spot that's considered a future aquifer, but.
What's the decision document, sorry?
The decision document
Is that
from
ESD
2000.
or
Yeah, so there was like it's interesting, 'cause it was like, there was a ROD, like an interim record of decision in the 90s. And then in 2006, they did and they call it an ESD, explanation of significant differences. So it basically amended the interim ROD. So at some point, they have to have a final record of decision. So that's what they want to work towards.
I was only mentioning that because when this all comes out, I think what happens is it's presented to the public as a variety of different options. And EPA and the state come together for basically what our preferred alternative is. And then
We issue a proposed plan.
we issue
Yeah.
a proposed plan, which goes out for public comment. And so, we can keep you all looped in on the status of that, so you have a little bit of a heads up when that happens. And it's a relatively formal process in that we receive comments on the
Yeah.
document, we respond to those comments. So it is a pretty lengthy process before
Mhm.
we'll have some kind of decision document, but
So the town and the citizens will have an opportunity for some feedback to
yes.
Yeah,
present
so
you
we'll
folks,
say,
okay.
we'll propose what we think would be a good remedial alternative, and then it goes out for public comment, yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And when is that
Mm.
anticipated? Are we talking
Yeah,
6
originally
months
we
from now?
were looking for June. I think now it's gonna probably be sometime either like July or August timeframe
Okay,
is what we're leaning toward, yeah. So it's called the proposed plan, yeah, so it's a formal process, and we typically would have a town meeting, right? Is that
Mhm.
normally have a
And
town meeting?
There's actually a formal oral hearing portion of it too, so we can collect oral comments, and it's Lisa would probably come and give a similar presentation on the alternatives and our preferred alternative, why that's what we could,
Okay.
That's great.
as our option.
Mhm.
And might
Mhm.
that have several different remedial techniques for different chemicals under different, geologic conditions?
Yeah, typically
Or it'd be
they
just-
doesn't get that
one fits all.
detailed, because they usually like to leave some room for, so if they say, in situ treatment, that could be chemical treatment or biological treatment or thermal treatment, so they kind of like to keep it sort of wide open, so that when it's being designed, there's some flexibility. So you're not held to something, and it's like, gee, if that thing doesn't work, you want to make sure you have flexibility to do something that's still under the same remedial category, but not so prescriptive. Because if you say, I'm going to inject permanganate into the ground, if for some reason the permanganate doesn't work, or it's not, you don't think it's going to be effective, you want to make sure you have like some flexibility
I
to
see,
do,
okay.
yeah.
Then you'd be
Then
li-
you're
Yeah.
stuck by it.
So they usually they'll categorize it sort of generally, so there's different So, treating something in place versus pumping something out, like pump and treat, where you're pulling something out and treating it. So, it'll probably be more of a general, so it won't be so prescriptive until they get into like the design phase of the remedy. Yeah.
So just to take a step back, so once the what's it called? It's a recommendation, it's a report, it's the results of the study?
Yeah, so there would be like a final like feasibility study report, and then there would be a proposed plan,
Right.
which would talk about the preferred, what EPA feels the preferred alternative is, and that would go out, which was mentioned, would go out for public comment.
Does it
and-
go like to the town first, and the towns? Like,
goes
I'm
in
just
general.
curious.
It's usually, it goes to everyone at once. I mean, in
Okay.
terms of, we could certainly call a day before or something, or keep you
Right.
posted, but it's, like I said, it's a relatively formal
Okay.
process, so
Okay.
the day it's issued is the day the opening of the public comment
Okay.
begins, so. But we can definitely, you
Yeah.
Yeah, like how do people even know? Like how would I
sure, so we work through the town to try and
Okay.
get it out through networks. We do issue a public notice in the paper.
okay.
Well, it helps
we-
that you have this committee too, because I feel like you could
Yeah,
probably
I
reach
mean, you know,
people
and-
more so than if people were just
Yeah.
having
And
to
we can
rely
put,
on reading
we can
about it in
put
the
that
paper or
right on the
something.
website, the
Yeah.
town
Yeah,
website
yeah,
as well.
whatever
Social
forums
media.
you
Right.
typically
Okay.
recommend, we could, if you have a social media page.
Yeah,
we
we
Mhm.
do.
that
Yeah,
would
we
be
do.
awesome.
Yeah. Not this committee, but the
Yeah.
town.
Yeah.
But I would think that they would look at us to have the public forum
Right, we would have to hold a public forum and,
Mhm.
so that way it would,
for you to
Makes
come
it
and present
beneficial.
it and
Yeah.
have
Yep.
an audience and,
Mhm.
right?
so, that works.
Mhm.
And then how long do you think how long does it take to wrap that all up and then?
Usually there's like at least like a 30-day comment period, right? And then sometimes
Okay.
it can be extended
Yeah,
at times.
I think it really depends.
Depends.
I mean, the comment period, it's not unusual for that to get extended to 60 days to give
Right.
people some time. And then we do have to, I know Lisa has to work with the team to respond to, we have to respond to
Respond to
all the
comments.
comments.
Okay.
We issue a document responding to those
Yeah.
comments, and then we issue a final plan, so
Okay.
months.
So it depends,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely
Yeah.
months
Mhm.
for
Yeah.
sure, yeah.
Yeah, because
Okay.
it took more than 60 days, I mean, 30 days just to get the four of us sitting here. And we're down one man, so.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And we don't wanna have, if it's like issued in July, it's not great timing for public
Right.
Yeah.
meetings, but we do like.
Scheduling is a,
Yeah.
scheduling is a,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
an issue.
Will there be any researching going
For what, Mark?
on? Researching for all the information coming in and what they can't find right offhand,
Mm-hmm.
they gotta dig deeper to
Mhm.
find that information.
Well, they have all the information now, they compiled the report. So
But
they
they
get,
don't have a report complete unless they get all that information from researching.
When you say researching, like,
Information that its chemical could be different in a certain time frame.
well, I think what she's saying, Mark, I don't want to
Oh.
put words in, but I
Oh, no,
think,
you
so
go
you're
ahead.
talking about for a solution for treating with a chemical? They wouldn't put that in the report, but they know what they're treating. They just don't.
yeah, because they usually have to do, during the design phase of remedies, they would they would do different like pilot testing and treatability testing to figure out what type of chemical or what type of method would be the best.
And you're doing all that
The
things
tree.
on site, you gotta go back and take the notes that they from there.
Yeah.
That's your research.
Yeah, so it's I'm newer to this. I'm a newer project manager, but yeah, my understanding is it's just sort of the proposed plans are, this is our general course of action. And when you get into like the design phase, that's where they'll dig deeper. Okay, based on that course of action, technically, that's where they get into all the technical details about exactly how it's going to be done. And a lot of times they call them, like here, they would have to do what's called like pre-design investigations. So they'd have to do further, investigations, like I said, maybe to find more DNAPL or to do more bedrock,
Or to measure
examination.
specific permeability of soils and, you
Yeah, all that type of stuff, yep.
know,
Mm-hmm.
So whatever the report finds, I mean, when would the action be taken? It probably wouldn't be I mean, it wouldn't be this season, right? I mean, it wouldn't be this year,
Right, and again,
It'd
that would
probably
be like, so we can propose, so each region for a given site, is my understanding, we can say, this is what we would want to do. But again, it has to be also funded, and, so that's what we're hoping.
So you would,
That would
at least next year before anything would probably,
Yeah,
happen?
we're hoping to get
Okay.
actually like a formal record of decision document this year. That's our objective, so.
Have you, will you consider, or as part of the design, or would you be doing any pilot studies? Like small scale
Yeah, that's
tests
exactly
to
what
see
they
if
do.
things are actually working before you
Mhm.
surge ahead in full scale?
Yes, yeah.
And at what point in the process would that come?
That's usually also during the design phase. I mean, I think technically like the extraction wells that they have in, they are calling them pilot testing. Like that's actually kind of a test to see if they do put extraction wells in, can it actually pull product out? So even those, I think, are sort of considered, if you read the decision documents from 2006, the interim ESD, it does talk about these extraction wells being sort of pilot testing. So before they put in 40 of them, they wanted to make sure that there were some that were actually productive, that they could actually
Yeah,
recover,
but with the
product recovery.
with the massive bedrock we have here, it's either, it's kind of hit or
Yeah.
miss whether you catch a fracture that has a lot of DNAPL and it's connected, and you're able to connect it to other fractures.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
collect. Otherwise, you can just drill a dry hole and,
Mhm.
2 feet away, you may find a larger fracture, but you
Yeah,
don't
and
know
that's why
without
some of-
drilling.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why some of the costs too, I think, are higher because of the, like what's called like the pre-design investigations for that very reason that you're saying with this highly fractured bedrock where these, unfortunately, the contaminants dense, right? So it sinks down into the bedrock. Over the years, so that basically, like I said, to try to find the fractures and to find the pools and where the product is accumulating, because that's really what you want to target for like mass reduction.
That was my main reason for asking about that,
Mm-hmm.
is that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and that's a really good point. You gotta find something to treat it, right? Yeah.
So just to go back for a sec, so we could,
I'm good.
by year end, have a formal record of decision, but there's no funding for it. So there's no guarantee through all of this that whatever the final proposal is actually funded. And I don't know
Yeah,
if
I
that
mean-
gets back to the,
Yeah, and it all depends on what the cost
Yeah.
associated with that
Of course.
decision is.
Yeah.
And, I haven't seen many sites where there's work ready to be done that they haven't had funding.
right,
At
right,
least,
once you
yeah,
get to
at
that
least
point,
some
you've already
funding.
invested, but.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, we just can't stand here and say for sure, but
Yeah,
To all
okay.
this
I'd like to think that.
respect
Yeah.
to the bylaw.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I don't know, I don't know if they incrementally fund things, or you can do parts of a remedy, yeah, we'll, and
Some
that's
sites
what we'll
get X
push on.
dollars a
think
year
that's what Lisa
until the
wants to
remedy
Right.
is finalized,
Yeah.
or
Mhm.
if we say
Yeah.
this is gonna cost, I don't know what the cost is associated with
Right.
it, but.
Okay.
They've got their info right up there, so that's pretty good.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
Just
Are we done?
yeah.
maybe,
Yeah.
maybe,
Everybody
a
else?
little, maybe a little confusion with it. Jeff, I don't know.
But actually, though, this administration is very supportive of like site redevelopment, so,
That's what I was.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
the solar on this site is,
They like that.
they love it.
yes.
Yeah.
So that is an objective, is to, move Superfund sites along, so, what's that?
Opposite of environmentals.
Yeah, so it's like they want actually a lot of these, because a lot of it, it's prime real estate,
Mhm.
and they want to see
Mhm.
places redeveloped, like in Woburn, there's definitely a push to do that.
They think, why should we need to be good kids?
I think we're all set.
All right,
Okay.
What about that?
I don't know, do we have any more questions here from the board? I think we've kind of been
Good,
asking
yeah.
questions as we've gone along. I
Yeah.
appreciate your
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
answers
Coming
and,
You're welcome. Do we want to
Yeah.
ask them any questions like
You know,
that we might
I
think
took
of?
some notes relative on your main points, I think.
Mhm.
So the 5-year review, part of what we do is community interviews, and we met with a resident, we spoke with Mark Orman, the health director. So generally, it's just whether or not you feel like EPA is keeping you well informed, if there's anything we could be doing better to that extent. heard everything here you need to hear about the feasibility study, so I don't know if you have any feedback now, or, you know, if you wanna send Lisa or I an email if you have any thoughts. We certainly need that.
I'm sure that at some point, when this goes out, it's broadcasting live now, but if others are seeing or watching something a little bit different, and then they have the time to watch this, I'm sure some of us will get phone calls and ask, you know, or directly, they have your information right up there on the board, so they
And
could
you're
call,
welcome to direct them to
they
us
call you
anytime.
directly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay for them to call
Absolutely,
directly, I just
Oh,
wanna
yeah,
make
yeah.
sure that, okay.
Anytime.
All
Okay.
right, great.
Yeah, I get phone calls too, sometimes, like, I think Mark Gorham's office he'll get calls from real estate agents or people
Mhm.
that are looking for homes too, and they might have, if they've never heard of Nyanza, they'll have questions about it,
Right.
and, or sometimes we'll just get, for people that are moving into like the rail transit district departments, they'll ask questions about, oh, is it, you know, it's here at the landfill, but is it on public water, you know, so just, it's usually nothing major,
Yeah.
so it's, but yeah, so we get a lot of questions coming our way, so.
Well, I want to, I know over the last couple of years, I'm on the Conservation Commission, and, you know, a number of projects that have come before us, we've, you know, we've brought your name and your subject into the conversation and said, look, go to the EPA, you've been very good about reviewing, developers' documents and looking at engineering things and providing feedback, providing a letter about things you advise and things you don't advise, and we do appreciate that. The turnaround has always been very quick, you know, couple of days or, you know, a week at most, and that's always very, very helpful.
I know, I
And,
try not to hold people, I know that people wanna move forward and they've, you know, they've
yeah.
got consultants
Well, we appreciate that,
paid
because
and-
it means a lot, and it's
That's
been
good to
very consistent information coming out from you, and, you know, I think the maps that you publish are immensely important, because
Yep.
people can follow them.
Mhm. It's good to hear. Yeah.
So I think if, you know, we can keep an open dialogue like that.
Mhm.
I think generally we try and steer people, I think, you know, through the Board of Health, and
Yeah.
let Mark Orm, the Board of Health, kind of answer as many questions, and then let Mark contact you, you know, just so you're not inundated with, you know, a zillion phone calls, but, you know, because a lot of the stuff we can kind of answer in-house here.
Yeah, I think he vets some of the calls, and then if it's something more specific, he
Mhm.
can refer to us. I mean, yeah, you know, sometimes it'll be like a couple calls a week. So far, it hasn't been, you know,
Okay,
unmanageable.
all right, well, we sure appreciate that,
Mhm.
that, you know, the openness and the.
And the
uh,
willingness to take the calls.
Yeah.
Yes, and, you know, I think it also, you know, gives me a good feeling that, you know, you're constantly looking at it and revising it, and, you know, this is a big behemoth that we're
Mhm.
trying to move along very slowly, but it
Yeah.
is still moving forward,
Mhm.
which is good, because it has a lot of moving parts, and,
Appreciate
yeah, I mean, we'll keep the pressure on, because, you know, people do want to do some developing down around town.
Mhm.
You know, we'd like to see that, but we also want it to make sure that it's done wisely
Mhm.
and, you know, without affecting the plume.
Mhm. Yeah, and we've
Some of
had
the
some
challenges
developers,
ahead of us are, you know, stormwater management
Yeah.
and maybe rebuilding some of the culverts. You know, I mean, they're all underground. You know, we've got a mishmash of culverts coming through town here that
Mhm.
sort of work and sort of don't, and, you know, it'd be nice if, you know, we can keep the stormwater as a, you know,
Yeah.
on the surface and
Mhm.
out, keep it from mixing with the groundwater, and just get it to move along to the Sudbury River, and treat the groundwater separately, so
Yeah.
eventually we're going to have to do something about it.
Yeah.
But that's way down the road for us too, so there'll be more interaction with you all on that.
Yeah, we've had even some developers that have been proactively, like, I think one of the Main Street properties that they were gonna redevelop, you know, actually somebody proactively did some, you know, sub-slab vapor testing on their own, just to get an idea, because Massachusetts does have some standards, they've got like commercial, standards to determine, you know, does anything exceed, like a screening value, it was just basically like screening levels for for sub-slab, contamination. So, yeah, we've had one developer that just like proactively did some testing on their own, so I feel like people are aware of it, and it may be because the planning department is keeping people informed, or the health department is keeping people informed too, so there seems to be knowledge ahead of time with a lot of these developers.
I think
and
they're,
it's-
you
yeah.
know, savvy developers that, you know, understand the liabilities of
Yeah.
owning property and doing an environmental assessment before they,
Mhm.
and before they get into it and while they're getting into it.
Right.
All right, if,
Thank you again,
any other
ladies.
questions?
you for
Mark,
coming.
you're our public, if you don't have any
I
other
know you're
questions?
public
They
tonight.
came out.
Okay, thank you.
All right,
Thank
well, then, if nothing else, then somebody can make a motion to close the hearing?
So moved.
To
Adjourn,
Adjourn.
I'm
That's
sorry.
okay.
Motion
second
made
it.
and second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.